Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Centre for London public webinar on London's green recovery, which comes ahead of London Climate Action Week starting on the 1st of July. We're very pleased to have you all with us. My name is Ben Rogers, and I'm the founding director of Centre for London, and I'll be your chair today. Just a few words on Centre for London and why we're holding this event. Centre for London is the capital's dedicated think tank. We develop new solutions to London's critical challenges, and we advocate for a fair, sustainable and prosperous global capital. We publish research, stage events, convene and influence. The pandemic has understandably worked to divert attention from climate change, but we all know that the situation is getting worse almost day by day. All the polling shows that the public has become hugely more worried about the issue over the last couple of years, and most of the boroughs have declared a climate emergency, as has the mayor, who set a demanding target to get London carbon zero by 2030. And of course, climate change is not just a challenge, it's also an opportunity. It's an economic and social opportunity to create a healthier, greener, more inclusive and efficient city. And it's a political opportunity for the political parties and the politicians who manage to harness that growing public concern. It's interesting to see how well the Greens did in this weekend's regional and local elections in France, and how well Anne Hidalgo did, getting re-elected as Mayor of Paris on a very green ticket, perhaps a lesson for the Mayor. Against that background, we're delighted to have the Mayor of London, Sadiq, with us to kick off the keynote address. And without further ado, thank you again, Sadiq, for coming, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, look, thank you, Ben, for that kind introduction. It really is great to be able to join you today, even if not in the usual way. Before we begin, I'm conscious, Ben, you can only see my top half. So let me start by reassuring you that as well as this shirt and this jacket, I'm also wearing my suit trousers, not a pair of jogging bottoms. This is the Centre for London, after all. But seriously, giving a speech is a bit strange as you aren't able to hear or interact with your audience as normal. So I just assume the only reason I couldn't hear you laughing at my jogging bottoms joke is because you're on mute. But seriously, I want to start by paying tribute to the Centre for London for hosting this discussion at this crucial moment for our city. And can I also echo, Ben, my congratulations to my good friend Anne on her fantastic victory yesterday in the Paris mayoral elections. Climate change is the defining issue of our generation. But there are some things that can give us hope during these difficult times. If the right choices are made to kickstart and support our economic recovery with a major stimulus program and high levels of public investment, then we have a real opportunity to accelerate our society's transition to a new low carbon model. To do this, however, we need to make clear that a strong recovery and a green recovery are not mutually exclusive, but one and the same. And this is because a green recovery would enable us to enact policies and make the investments that are not only necessary to protect our environment, but to create the jobs and prosperity our country and our city needs. As Mayor, I've been a big supporter of the global Green New Deal movement for some time. With green investments in jobs, skills, technology, infrastructure and industry, we can create millions of new jobs, unleash the inclusive and sustainable growth that's required to get us out of this crisis, and fix the flaws in our society that have been exposed for all of us to see in recent months. That's why, in my view, the struggles for social justice and climate justice can't be separated, but go hand in hand. My Green New Deal for London, announced prior to the pandemic, is about growing our economy, creating the jobs of the future for Londoners, and supporting the green industries that are crucial to meeting our city's climate targets. This is on top of all the other initiatives we've already introduced in London. I'm proud we now have the boldest and most ambitious plans of any major city in the world to tackle the twin challenges of air pollution and climate change. And we've already seen how the ultra low emission zone is making a huge difference to both air quality and our climate, reducing pollution levels in central London by a third, cutting carbon emissions by 13% in the zone, boosting our attempts to make London zero carbon by 2030, and making London a more economically competitive city in the process. But now more than ever, we need a national effort with the same level of ambition, an industrial and regional policy fit for the 21st century that tackles the climate emergency while stimulating economic activity and delivering green collar jobs. This should involve running our economic bailout packages through a green lens and attaching green strings to bailouts, channeling public spending into green energy projects, and also make sure that we invest in infrastructure and job creation schemes that are green, as well as devolving greater powers to enable cities and regions across the country to implement targeted local green recovery packages. Without this national action, it will undoubtedly be much harder for us to realise the full potential of a green and strong recovery in London. But if then the government drags its feet, which I fear and many fear, then I won't be willing to wait. We'll continue in London with the bold climate leadership that's become a hallmark of our city in recent years. Let me end by saying this. We've seen the dangers of responding too slowly to COVID-19. And we mustn't make the same mistake again with the climate emergency. The consequences would be too high and the human cost too great. We have, in my view, a once in a generation opportunity to rebuild our cities and our economies so that they're cleaner, greener, more sustainable, and better geared towards meeting the needs of our citizens. So let's seize, not squander it, for the sake of our prosperity, our people, and our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadiq. Thank you very much. And I know you've got to go in a few minutes, but perhaps time just for a couple of questions. I suppose the first is, to what extent is the prioritising of the pandemic in response to the recovery setting back City Hall's own climate action plans, and how are you ensuring any impact on your climate ambition is being minimised?
That's a really good question, Ben. I think the really important thing is for us to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And let me be frank, I mean, most of my priorities over the last 13, 14 weeks have been focused on saving lives, using the life necessarily, supporting working care homes, helping small businesses stay afloat, making sure our public transport is as safe as it can be, making sure we support them during this difficult time. But at the same time, working to make sure a recovery is a green recovery. We're doing great with the C40 colleagues. I've had many chats with mayors around the world, which are really important to learning from each other. A part of recovery, so I'm doing the work with in relation to both transition and recovery. It is really important to do more than one thing at a time. That's what's important. But I talked about a green recovery, and that means making sure that we learn the lessons from COVID-19. One of the lessons were, Ben, that we can't assume the market has all the answers to the challenges we face, an active policy and intervention from local, regional, and central government. And we've made sure that during the COVID crisis, we've used it, and I hate to use this word, but use it as an opportunity to make sure that we can work towards a green-led recovery.
So what are the, I mean, practically, what are the opportunities when it comes to, I mean, how have things changed? You're a consummate politician. How have things changed? How has the pandemic changed the public attitudes, and where do you see you can really sort of go forward with policy?
Yeah, I'll give you some practical examples. So one of the things that I asked Heidi, my Deputy Mayor for Transport, Heidi Alexander, and Ward Norman, my walking and cycling commissioner, to work on was how we avoid a car-led recovery. So the London Street Space programme is the most ambitious of any major city in the world. We will have, and we already have now, arguably the biggest car-free zone of any centre of any global city in the world. We've now, in the space of a few weeks, managed to have more than 15,000 square metres of pedestrianised spaces in London. Also more than 5 kilometres of new segregated cycle lanes. So when I became mayor, we had, roughly speaking, 50 kilometres of segregated cycle lanes. We're now north of 165 and going in one direction. And so that's an example of what we can do to have a green recovery going forward. I've seen, Ben, amazing enthusiasm from people to move towards walking and cycling. And this is one of the lessons we can learn, is actually people are far more ambitious and moving far quicker than politicians, and they're far more nimble. And one of the opportunities we have is to try and make sure that we use this energy there is, local recovery, how we support our independent shops, how we support local communities. Do really need to travel from zone 4, zone 5 to zone 1 when it comes to shopping, when it comes to leisure, when it comes to working from home to provide lots of opportunities. So there are opportunities here, and we've got to seize that. But also I think what's clear is, as good as a market is, there often needs an active industrial policy, whether it's a carbon recovery, whether it's small businesses helping, medium-sized businesses helping big businesses, but also helping people get around our city safely as well. And I think what this has shown is people are quite savvy, and they're willing to move much quicker than politicians. One quick example is, I was looking weeks ago for us to wear face coverings in public transport, because people will do that, but politicians were quite slow to react. Local government moved, and the take-up's been phenomenal, Ben. I think on the first day, we had 85% of Londoners were in face coverings on buses and tubes, which is remarkable. So there are lessons here, and what we're going to do is during Climate Action Week to try and see that enthusiasm people and along the government to move as fast as people are.
Your sound keeps coming on. So just with one more question, and actually a question from a member of the audience. What is your sort of key ask? If you had just one ask from government when it comes to climate change in London, what would it be?
Give us the powers and resources we need to get to zero carbon as soon as possible by 2030. We've got half the powers and resources we need, and we're taking action with transport. Give us the other powers and resources we need to, for example, retrofit our buildings, for example, to make sure we can have a green recovery, to make sure we can make other parts of London greener sooner rather than later. You've seen London is responding to recycling more, to cutting out waste, to shopping locally. That's been voluntary. With more powers and resources, we can get zero carbon to 2030. We've got the ambition. Londoners have the ambition. Government, give us the powers and resources we need to fulfil the ambition of Londoners. Brilliant,
Sadiq. I know you've got to go. Thank you so much. I'm sure we're all giving you a sort of virtual round of applause. Keep up the great work, and we'll be pleased to keep working with you. Stay safe. Thanks, Ben, and good luck with the conference for today. Cheers. Bye. Right. In terms of the format for the rest of the event, our speakers will now share their response to the Mayor's keynote, and we'll get a discussion going, and we'll take questions from you, the audience. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Mark Watts, Executive Director of C40's Cities Climate Leadership Group, the network of megacities committed to addressing climate change. Minea Heru-ur, Corporate Affairs Director of London First, the leading London business group. Shirley Rodriguez, Deputy Mayor for the Environment and Energy. And in terms of your own involvement, people can, on Zoom, can ask questions via the Q&A function, and you can vote up other questions if there's a particular one you would like to see asked. We also have many people following us on YouTube, and those people can feed in questions on Twitter using the hashtag LDN Green Recovery. LDN Green Recovery, and that's also the hashtag to use for any related tweets. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can in the next hour and a quarter. So there will be at some point a chance to take part in a poll, but without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mark Watts from C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. That's great to be part of this. And I thought really heartening to hear what Mayor Khan said. It feels exactly the the right approach for London to be taking. The recovery must not just be about an attempt to return to business as usual, aside from the fact that we haven't finished dealing with the COVID pandemic yet. Returning to business as usual would mean going back on track for 3 degrees or more of global overheating. And essentially, climate breakdown is like a pandemic in slow motion, with even bigger impacts, even greater problems for society if we don't solve it. And so I think that approach that the Mayor outlined of planning a recovery that both solves the immediate problems around unemployment, but does so in a way that corrects long-running environmental failings and long-running social injustices is exactly right. It's very consistent, I have to say, with what we hear from mayors across the world in C40, which is the kind of big city mayors around the world. And I think there's a renewed confidence amongst those mayors, despite the gravity of the situation and the health crisis around COVID, that in many cases we're hearing mayors saying they see stronger levels of trust in government at a city level than they've seen previously, stronger levels of public support for data-driven government, for science-driven government, and indeed trust in public services, which have been the backbone of responding to the crisis in so many places. And all of that is good news if like C40, you're focused on tackling the climate crisis, because it's been lack of public support, lack of focus on a really data-driven, science-led approach to the global problem of climate breakdown that meant that we have been drifting into this extraordinary crisis. I thought also interesting, London really is a world leader in what the Mayor and Shirley are doing on the environmental programme in general, particularly what we heard on the transport sector. I thought the streetscape stuff is really superb, and you can see cities all across the world looking at what London is doing, having seen the success of the congestion charge, the low emission zone, now looking at how London is responding to keep the city moving, despite what is I've never seen a crisis like it in my professional life around public transport, the backbone of any sustainable city, and yet having massively reduced capacity, people afraid to use the system. But we're now seeing cities helping each other think how to run public transport safely and to get that capacity back up, but also taking these really bold moves to hugely increase the zero carbon forms of transport, of cycling and walking. Paris, as we've seen, I think that's a really defining moment, as you mentioned in your introduction, Ben, because not only has Mayor Hidalgo won very comfortably in the end, but she absolutely stood on a green platform. Only a couple of years ago, she looked down and out in the opinion polls because she was getting hit so hard on the policies that she brought in to pedestrianise large parts of the centre of the city and investing very heavily in public transport and cycling. She stood her ground, she faced down that opposition, and has in the end, because of the success of those policies, really brought the public behind it. And we see very similar things now right across the world. The Mayor of Bogota, huge increase, 80 kilometres of new cycle lanes during this COVID crisis. Lisbon is reducing speed limits right across the city, having huge amounts of cycle parking. San Francisco taking away road parking space to encourage more of a cafe culture and cycling and walking. And I think generally a sense that this is a moment to take big steps, not small. Look at in Melbourne, where the Mayor is now planning to deliver in 2 years the cycling programme that had been planned over 10 years. And again, I think that's fairly typical. I think that some of the issues that have to be tackled, though, as Mayor Khan mentioned, is the leadership at a city level needs to be supported at a national level. And you can see in the kind of differences in powers that mayors have across the world. The Mayor of Seoul, for example, is undertaking a huge job creation programme by retrofitting to improve the energy efficiency of every municipal building across the whole of the city, and doing it in 2 years. They'll have retrofitted every single building by the end of 2022, which he can do because he's got pretty sweeping powers and a very large number of buildings that are owned or regulated by the city authority. Similarly, in New York, the Mayor is able to impose really tough regulation on on commercial buildings to retrofit them. London doesn't enjoy those same powers. There's been amazing things on new building regulation, but if it was empowered and given those powers by government, we could see the same levels of job creation and the same levels of emission reduction. And perhaps to finish, I think the other reflection that I see looking at an international city level is the extraordinary contrast between the failure of multilateralism in the COVID crisis at a national government level, when we've just seen a whole load of independent national approaches, a real failure to congregate around a global approach through the agencies, the World Health Organization, etc. that exist. Whereas at the city level, it's been an extraordinary coming together. Right from the start of the crisis, mayors reached out to each other, have been talking to each other through C40 and others on a weekly, daily in some cases, basis, and really saving lives and solving problems. We've had groups of mayors in C40, for example, because there were international guidelines on how to manage waste in the context of COVID, developed those guidelines themselves, and then they've spread right across the world so that many major cities are using them. And the same thing has happened in transport, in buildings, in many other sectors. So I think you're seeing the way forward at a city level, building back better a green recovery based on data and science, and based on multilateralism, based on collaboration internationally. And we need national governments to be empowering cities more, because in that way we'll get a better recovery much more quickly.
Great. And thank you, Mark. And it's just so interesting, isn't it, the way in which sort of cities don't seem to see other cities as rivals in the way that nations so often do see other nations as rivals. And I don't know whether it's just because cities don't actually sort of physically abut each other in the way that nations abut each other, but they certainly have a history of being much more collaborative. And I think we have, as you say, seen that in the recent crisis. Right, over to Minea Heru-ur from London First. And from the perspective of London businesses, I mean, do you see this need to combat climate change as a burden or an opportunity? Muniya.
Absolutely an opportunity, Ben. And we share the Mayor's view that this needs to be a green recovery, and it's going to take business and all levels of government working together to achieve our ambitious climate targets. And what we want to see is what little good has come out of this crisis to build back better. So I'm going to focus on a couple of areas today. First, how business is juggling the immediate challenges of the crisis alongside its climate change aspirations. And then I'm going to touch on three sectors: tourism and travel, transport, and construction. So when the lockdown was announced, the focus of business, as you'd expect, was on keeping staff safe and cash flow to ensure survival. And now that focus has shifted from the immediate health crisis to recovery. What's become really clear in our conversations with members about how we build back better is that we don't repeat the mistakes of the 2008 financial crisis and lose sight of the green agenda. So at London First, we've created a net zero working group. We're bringing together about 30 of our members to look at the challenges and opportunities presented by COVID. So we think there needs to be a rapid focus on what a roadmap to achieving our emissions targets looks like, and that will need to be broken down into verticals like transport, construction, and aviation. So turning to tourism, the big question is, how do we restart that in a sustainable way? And prior to the crisis, there were concerns about over-tourism and whether that was putting too much strain on the city. The impact of air travel on emissions is evidenced in the debate around Heathrow and squaring carbon targets with expansion. So although it's likely that air travel, business travel is likely to be reduced for some time, we do need the industry to return to long-term success in a sustainable way. And that's because we need the growth generated by tourism travel and the jobs they support, as well as the contribution they make to the vibrancy of our city. So the gradual reopening of the hospitality sector is good news, museums and galleries as well, but we want to see more done for theatres. And we think now's the time to be thinking about how we bring tourists back to London. So starting with domestic and then international, because that's what underpins so much of the economic activity in the capital. So in the West End, about 50% of retail sales come from international tourists. So we want to see a risk-based targeted approach, air bridges. And so we're looking forward to hearing from the government on restarting international travel this week. But clearly restarting tourism isn't going to be possible if the transport network's on its knees. So the changes the pandemic's brought about, our travel behaviour's taken a big bite out of TfL's revenues. Fares are down, I think it's 90%. While many of us are able to work from home, and some of you may be enjoying the home working webinar lifestyle, we do want to get people back into the capital and spending when the time's right. And London's in a unique position because we rely much more heavily on public transport than other parts of the country. It's just 3 in 10 Londoners that drive to work, which is half the rate of any other UK region. But we don't want to see a car-based recovery, so we do need to give people confidence about getting on public transport and ensure that TfL has sustainable funding. And that's going to require a mix of carrot, sticks and creativity. So where there are opportunities to expand existing network capacity, such as on the river, we should be seizing those. The focus on cycling and walking, absolutely welcome. Micromobility has a role to play here, so dockless bikes and e-scooters, but we're conscious that it needs to be done in a coordinated way so we don't end up with cluttered streets that could pose a risk to safety. We also think it's time to look at how London pays for its roads. So ULEZ will be extended, but over time we might expect to see that phased out as people switch to more energy efficient vehicles. And it's worth considering whether the time's right to look at a second generation of road pricing. On construction, there's been a lot of progress made on sustainable buildings with lower carbon footprints, but as we've heard, the challenges around retrofitting existing stock. So the majority of that's not energy efficient, so you have gas boilers and poor insulation. So we need to see a comprehensive plan. We need significant government support, and we know there's an announcement hopefully later this week, and more carrots to encourage private sector investment. So in summary, the pandemic presents an opportunity to rebuild the economy in a sustainable way. With COP26 next year, we don't want to squander another year. We need leadership to ensure government at all levels works with business and consumers. So we really start to see the behavioural and policy changes that we need to deliver those net zero goals.
Thank you, Muniya. That's great. I like your call for some form of more modern road user charging system. It's something that we've certainly called for at Centre for London. I'm sure there'll be questions about that, and if there aren't, I will ask one. But finally, over to Shirley Rodriguez, who's Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy on the Greater London Authority, so working for the Mayor. Shirley.
Thanks, Ben, and great to be working with you. We've had a long history, as Sadiq talked about, working with you, but also London First and C40. And I'm not going to repeat what Sadiq said, but it's absolutely clear that he's clear that we need a green recovery, a strong and quick recovery with really good, high quality jobs that go hand in hand with that. And in terms of what we're doing, we're already quite a significant global climate and environment hub, something in the order of £40 billion worth of sales, and we employ about 250,000 people across a number of companies in that low carbon environmental goods and services sector, and that's seen a massive increase in the last few years. So how do we decarbonise faster and more efficiently by the Mayor's target of 2030? Well, first of all, we have to show leadership, and I think, as Sadiq has mentioned, we've been doing a lot over the last few years, with our actions on, developing our 1.5 degree plan, looking at what we're trying to do on electrification of our transport system. We have a number of technical assistance programs on retrofitting and so on. These are all areas of investment and growth that we think, if we accelerated, would really help London come out of the pandemic and the lockdown and try and recover and build back better, and also contribute to the sort of systemic change that we need to have to make sure that London is a zero carbon city. And this means jobs, and we really need to focus on that with, for example, our skills and training budgets, but also looking at a number of programs around retrofitting our buildings, which a number of people have mentioned, which can both create jobs, but brings lots of other co-benefits around tackling fuel poverty, reducing ill health outcomes and improving air quality. Boosting our renewable energy sector. We've been doing quite a lot of work on community energy and supporting that area, because we're sort of limited in what we're able to do in London, and that's really the big focus here. carrying on what we've been doing on electric vehicle charging and electrification of vehicles. And importantly, looking to see how we can drive this green investment by looking at divestment, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But as Sadiq mentioned, we need a lot of, we need more powers and finance. We don't have the powers to do all the things that we have. Mark mentioned the ability of Seoul and New York to really drive building energy efficiency. We don't have that. We've got a number of programs that we're working with local authorities and housing associations to do more. But if we really wanted to accelerate action, then we need those additional powers so that we can really lead the way. And in terms of what we are doing, we have a number of projects, quite a big portfolio and a comprehensive one of project development support for public sector workplaces and homes and on district energy. And these are all developing a pipeline of investable decarbonisation projects. This is really just, you know, just sort of foot in the water of what we really need to be doing. We need to do much more, which is why we're calling on government to provide more funding. And we're looking with interest about their announcement on retrofit, although disappointed to see what the FT was reporting today. But alongside developing those projects, we're also building up our green financing efforts. The Mayor has already funded an energy efficiency fund, bringing together a number of investors to create a £500 million loan fund, providing low-cost capital. And we're looking to enhance that when, you know, as that comes to its full capitalisation, essentially. We understand that certainly around 85% of the current fund is already covered potentially by pipeline, so we need to build much more into that fund. We've estimated that we need something in the order of £10 billion of investment, capital investment, in order to retrofit our homes and buildings in London. And we've been calling on government to not only devolve more powers around building energy efficiency, but also around how we might make sure that heat networks are designated and connected up, and not rowing back on the work that we've been doing and leading on zero carbon homes through new development, which has really seen no problems around viability, but, you know, actually developers coming forward with better performance well over the minimum building regulations standard. So at the same time as doing that, you know, Sadiq talked about how we might carry on harnessing the energy and inspire Londoners to do more. So all the efforts that we're doing on the street space strategy, for example, is really building on the fact that we've had to you know, through lockdown, many of us work from home, but also the resurgence of volunteering and understanding the value of access to green space and the new focus on community. How can we work much more on that? And then just to end, I think, you know, just not forgetting that, as we all know, the pandemic has really hit hard the most vulnerable of our communities, especially the Black and minority ethnic communities. And this has exacerbated the existing inequalities. So his focus on a Green New Deal really encompasses this inequalities agenda and recognising much as, you know, as we have done with air pollution and our air quality work, that this is a social justice issue. Climate impacts are going to affect everyone, but it's the most socially vulnerable populations that are going to be hit the hardest. And we'll have seen how some of the boroughs, the most deprived boroughs in London, like Newham and Brent and so on, have been hit hardest by COVID. And these are all factors that around age and health and ethnicity, but also environmental characteristics like poor housing stock and air pollution hotspots, as well as social characteristics like levels of income. These are all things that we need to be addressing as we tackle climate change, particularly in London. And that means better jobs, looking at those inequalities and not rolling back progress on the sort of progress that we have made on some of our environmental goals, but really building back better. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. And we've got lots of questions coming in, but let me just ask one or two. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in the last point that you made, Shirley, and this is for all our panelists, about the overlap between issues of climate change and inequality, or people keep talking about an adaptation to in addressing climate change in ways which are socially equitable. I remember we did some bit of work a couple of years ago looking at the areas which are most vulnerable to flooding in London and the areas which were most vulnerable to high heat temperatures. And as it alluded to already, Shirley, they are largely in Tower Hamlets, Newham, and basically the poorest parts of London. But I mean, what practically should our priorities be if we want a sort of socially just low carbon economy, or to move towards a socially just low carbon economy? Mark, I mean, perhaps starting with you. So you know, where are the real opportunities both to address climate change and to address poverty and inequality?
Well, I mean, I think in general is a very good fit. And if you look in most of the big Western cities, the single biggest opportunity for reducing emissions quickly is what we've all been talking about. It's improving the energy efficiency of buildings, which consume most of our energy. That is something that has huge job creation potential, and very quickly and at many different levels of skills, and therefore open to lots of people who will have been made unemployed during this crisis, and lots of people in lower income occupations. But it's also, if it's designed in the right way, i.e. starting with the sectors of housing in the most vulnerable areas, it's a way of greatly improving quality of life and reducing costs of living for those who are on the lowest income. You know, I think where you see the issue here is it's often easier to work in areas, you know, in the middle class areas. It's often easier to do things that don't really help the most vulnerable. And that, I think that's, if you're really talking about that global Green New Deal, it's the commitment that you're going to start all of your policies by looking at how does this help the most vulnerable, whilst I'm also delivering my carbon reduction or improvement of resilient ends. And sometimes that's going to mean making some decisions that aren't obvious. In Los Angeles, for example, they started their electric car sharing schemes in the poorest districts of the city. Every model anywhere in the world will tell you that's the wrong way to do it. The people most likely to do it are going to be young, affluent people in professional jobs, but because of the commitment around social justice, that's where they started, and they've been able to make it work, and then branched out from there.
Great. Muniya, what would your priorities be if it was about both addressing climate change and advancing equality or combating inequality?
So I think on the climate change side, we need a clear plan, and we need to see that collaboration from at all levels of government, from borough, GLA to central government. And on the skills side, clearly we're all worried about youth unemployment. That's disproportionately high among BAME communities. So there's a real opportunity here to reskill our young people into some of those green jobs. So the whole retrofitting piece, EV infrastructure, these all present huge opportunities, and those need to be, you know, there needs to be a clear plan from government on how to target that. Brilliant.
And Shirley, lastly from you, because you talked quite high level about the need for a sort of socially just strategy for climate change, but what does that mean in practical terms for the mayor?
It's sort of what we're doing already. So what we've identified is a number of areas that we have to immediately address. So Mark's already mentioned retrofitting of buildings. We've looked at that from not just a carbon point of view, but from a fuel poverty point of view. So targeting our programs to make sure through our Warm Homes Advice Service that we're identifying people who need help, and then sort of acting as a sort of pipeline for the retrofit programs. And then using a sort of quite holistic way of people, you know, pre-lockdown going into buildings, but post-lockdown using sort of videos, people using their phones to sort of inspect homes, but looking at it from not just going in and replacing the boiler, but looking at how you might look at insulation, look at the sort of ventilation of the building, so that we're tackling health outcomes. We've created a number of tools and mapping over the last few years so that we can really target our funding. So a lot of our, for example, our Greener City funding has been looking at how we might look at where there is little public open space for communities, and then target our funding to boroughs and community organisations in those areas, so we start to enhance the access for people to those areas where they have little access either to private gardens or to sort of larger open space. So those are just a few things. They're all on our website if people want to have a look at them.
Very good. Right, let's get down to our poll, because the audience has been listening for a long time now. How's this going to work? Are we going to see a poll pop up? Maybe not. Anyway, oh, here it is. Okay, so Mayor's #1 priority on climate change should be banning petrol and diesel cars and vans faster, electrifying heating, decarbonising public transport, reducing air travel, carbon emission targets for businesses, or other. So I'm told that hosts and panelists can't vote. I guess that's only fair. This is your chance, and I will give you the results in a few questions. So we've got lots of questions now from the audience. I might start with one from Trevor Chin, which is about charging points. I mean, we haven't done very well in driving down or decarbonising London's transport system, particularly when it comes to vehicles. Clearly, part of that answer is going to be getting people on bicycles and walking, and so we've talked about that. But part of that answer has got to be about electrifying the vehicle fleet. Yet it does seem that charging points are few and far between, particularly for you, Shirley. What progress is being made on that?
I think huge progress. I wouldn't say there were few and far between. We created the world's first electric vehicle infrastructure task force, which brought together a number of key stakeholders, including London First, but the Society of Motor Manufacturers and others, took away we needed to ram our charging points, and that really focused on the need for more rapid charge points, but also the more standard charge points at borough level. We've been helping fund, partly using government funding, partly using TfL funding and borough funding, more charge points. We have, I think 25% of the charge points in the UK are based in London, and we have one of the largest networks in Europe of rapid chargers already. One of the conclusions of that task force is, we're in good stead at the moment, bearing in mind the take-up of electric vehicles, but for the future, we really need to be looking at more hub-based approaches around town centres, which really fits with the sort of work that we're doing or that we're going to need to do post, as we transition out of lockdown in sort of helping people to work and do business, and have leisure more locally. So I think actually there's a lot of work that's been done that maybe not been recognised, but obviously it's not enough if we're looking to electrify our transport fleet more, post getting people back onto public transport, walking and cycling.
Brilliant. Should we have the results of our poll? Are they up yet? Are they in yet? Right. So I'm guessing the winner is banning petrol and diesel cars and vans faster, and then decarbonising public transport. So I mean, I get a question. I'm afraid lots of the questions are going to be addressed to you, Shirley, but you are representing the mayor here. When do you think we should be banning or having got rid entirely of diesel and petrol cars in London?
Well, the mayor has said 2030 and has been asking the government to move faster. I think the CCC in its report last week talked about 2032. It's absolutely clear that if we really need to tackle the climate emergency and tackle air pollution, that we really need to be moving much faster. And we're seeing a number of companies starting to move into, go down that route, having sort of kicked their heels for a bit. They realise this is, the writing's on the wall, and regulation absolutely plays a part in this. So one of the things that the mayor did in saying no more new diesel taxis, I would only license electric taxis, has seen a huge investment in electric vehicles, with investment coming in, not in London, but part of the levelling up agenda, sort of out in Anstey, in the Midlands, with the London Electric Vehicle Company creating the ZEC taxi line, and then another line for production of vans. So this was obviously caught up with the pandemic fallout at the moment, but it's an example of how good regulation on climate change and environment can really drive the new industries and the jobs that we all need, and that just transition into better, cleaner, high quality paying jobs.
Great. And I think, Muniya, do you want to make a response to that? And, yeah, particularly the role of business in some of this?
Yeah, we did a survey recently of around 500 business leaders on whether they were planning to convert their fleet cars to electric vehicles. And it was really encouraging because around a third have already begun using electric vehicles. But when looking at things like barriers, it was mainly the lack of infrastructure and charging infrastructure that was the biggest issue that was holding them back. As well as low availability of vehicles. So I think really we do need to address that infrastructure point if we're going to move forward with an electric car revolution and avoid a car-rich recovery.
Mark, how is London doing then on the electric infrastructure?
Well, the models we look at for what cities need to do across the world says 2030 is when you need to have all petrol and diesel vehicles off the roads in general. So London sort of right.
What would you be urging the mayor to do then? I mean, is it a new system of congestion charging, sort of much more flexible? You pay per distance and per contribution to congestion?
Yeah, I think it's an extension of what's been done so far, because it's the lead from the public sector in investing in electric taxis, electric buses that's around the world has really completely shifted electric vehicle markets. Then the regulation restricting cars, polluting vehicles, congestion charge in the low emission zone, again, sent such a strong market signal. I think we're going to see major cities around the world, maybe it'll be London first, maybe it's somewhere else, that really now start to adopt comprehensive citywide road user charging, but based on emissions as well as time and distance, because you can see that's just going to be necessary in most big cities.
So Shirley, what role do you see for that? And are you urging the mayor to give it serious thought?
Well, I think you might have heard the mayor at saying before that our focus is on, first of all, sorting out the temporary extension of the congestion charge. As we transition out of lockdown and getting people back to work. Then our focus is on the extension of the ultra low emission zone in 2021 October. So getting those sorted. But because there are huge issues around infrastructure that need to be addressed. If you're going to move to time of day. And differential sort of approaches to charging. I mean, it's really interesting. We can see that, for example, the work that we've done on ULEZ in central London has really helped drive the reduction in the number of cars coming into central London, sort of 44,500 fewer vehicles and much more compliance. I think what's one of the great things, as Muniya mentioned, was actually businesses are adopting this, recognizing that cleaning up their fleets is good for their workers, for their customers, and for operating in London. So the sorts of approach we're doing with the powers that we have is what we're pushing on. But yeah, let's see.
Great. Okay. A question from Bob Ward, which is: are we in danger of neglecting sort of the resilience side of addressing climate change and focusing too much just on carbon reduction? Muniya, London First thinking about resilience as well as mitigation? Well,
you may know that we incubated a business called Resilience First. So it's something that we have always thought about. And I think, we've seen flooding in London and other parts of the country. We've seen, changes in weather. So we absolutely do need to be focused on resilience as well as emissions. I think the two things go hand in hand.
Great. Mark or Shirley, do you want to say anything about resilience? Mark?
Yeah, I feel positive about this. I think the pandemic has really shown the necessity of having good government that uses science and data and plans for risks that have massive impacts, even if the likelihood of them happening is relatively small. And that all pushes towards a greater focus on resilience. It's the demand I'm hearing a lot from mayors around the world that they want more support around resilience, and mayors talking to each other about it. So I don't think it will get lost. I think actually the pandemic will push it up the agenda quite a lot.
Shirley.
It's absolutely the heart of what Sadiq talks about as our recovery efforts for London, not just a green recovery, but a fair recovery, but also a resilient recovery. We have over 1 million people living in areas at risk of flooding. We've talked in the environment strategy and then subsequently in the London resilience strategy about the impacts of overheating as well as various other risks. So the resilience strategy looks at a number of issues, not just climate impacts. And I think it's even more pressing, and Bob will have seen, again, the CCC talking about us needing to prepare for a 4-degree world, which is absolutely shocking, you know, really shocking. So no, it's absolutely at the heart of what we're doing. I know it's at the heart of what C40 is doing. So we're working with a number of other cities through C40 to share best practice and lobbying governments around the world to do much more in this area.
And Shirley, I have to ask you about Silvertown. I've got a lot of questions coming in from that. I mean, is the growing climate emergency and Sadiq's commitment to being net zero by 2030 mean that you're going to rethink Silvertown?
No, the mayor's been clear, it's going ahead, we've contracted. You know, there are reasons why Silvertown Tunnel was established. There are very few river crossings in the east of London. There was massive congestion leading to really bad air pollution, congestion, people not being able to get to work, and so on. It's been looked at a lot of times. We've looked at the air quality and carbon impacts of this, as has government, but the tolling on both the Blackwall Tunnel and on the new Silvertown Town Tunnel will mean no increases in traffic. So no increases in terms of air pollution and carbon. And it's all, you know, it's completely compatible with our 1.5-degree plan.
Okay. Well, I suspect I will get a lot more comments on that one.
I suspect you will.
Elsewhere. Right, the most popular question so far, and we have touched on this already, concerns green space from Neil Sinden. Public green space has been a massive benefit to Londoners over the past few months, yet the city has less green space per person than is required according to standard measures. How can we increase green space in London, especially in areas of deficiency? And can the mayor take a lead from Paris by removing over 70% of street car parking and turning the recovered space green? And that really is an important point. I think we talk a lot about road user charging and ULEZs and things, but parking is a sort of huge lever, and in many ways one which the boroughs have been very, very slow. I mean, you can still park for free on lots of TfL roads, some are amazed to discover or to see. Question, let me start actually with Mark on green space. Are there cities around the world that we can learn from when it comes to creating more green space, and particularly maybe removing all the cars parked on our roads?
Yeah, although actually London starts from a pretty good position. When you look at the amount of green space in London compared to most cities, it's very high. I think lots of mayors would love to start where Mayor Cohen is with the amount of green space in London. There are some interesting things been happening in the last few months. In Montreal, the mayor there has cancelled a massive new development that was planned in the city, and instead announced plans to create a huge new park instead. Actually, it's partly a resilience measure, improving flood resilience, also greater amount of tree planting, but also it's a recognition through the COVID crisis of the value of that public green space to people. That it's a public luxury that we need more of. I think, when you look at Paris, where the mayor has been tremendously strong in what she's done and consistent over the years in transferring space to the public and away from the small minority of car users. She benefits from having greater control over parking spaces than the Mayor of London enjoys, where it's dispersed throughout the boroughs, which allows a greater consistency. But actually, there's a lot of cities doing that. Lisbon now is taking away parking space and giving it out more to restaurants and cafes, so they've got greater space to have customers outside whilst we are physically distancing. San Francisco is doing something very similar.
Great. It seems to be the big opportunity that particularly Amsterdam that we can learn from Amsterdam, where what they do is whenever a home changes hands, they simply take away the parking space at that point, because it's much easier to do that then than it is when somebody's used to the idea of having a car park in front of their house. And I'm surprised to see the borough's not doing that. And I'm surprised again to see that you can so easily park for free on TfL roads at certain hours. Shirley, green spaces and car parking. And then I come to Muniya.
So Mark's already said, we start from a pretty good baseline, and we were declared designated a national park city last year because of the efforts that the mayor has been putting into creating and enhancing the quality of our green space, and that looks at, covers a whole host of issues from London plan policy through to the funding that we've been putting into supporting green space improvements, tree planting and so on. So it is critical. We don't think this is enough, and we've talked already about how the pandemic has highlighted the unequal access to green spaces. Not everybody has a private garden, not everybody is near a public open space. So part of the London plan policies is about how do we integrate green infrastructure and green space into new developments, and part of the sort of reclaiming of open space or roads really for to make space for sort of safe physical distancing as we come out of lockdown. What we're trying to do is make sure that these become legacy spaces, which are then green spaces for people to go and pursue leisure pursuits, or go shopping, or have a meal, or just relax. So those are really important things. I think the point though is London doesn't have a huge amount of space to sort of create new parts like Montreal. We'd love to do that. So a lot of our work is looking at quality of space and making sure that people do have some access. And in terms of reclaiming car parking spaces, again, Mark mentioned, we don't have those powers. 95% of the roads where people are parking are owned by the boroughs. And you'll have seen quite a few boroughs, Hackney and others, that are reclaiming parking spaces. You can ask for a parking space to be designated into a parklet, and we're starting to see some. I saw something tweeted today where people were using this as a space to put tables out so people can have a coffee in a more sort of safe way. On Transport for London, the roads that they operate, 5% are the main sort of arteries of London, so they need to be kept moving. So I think that's probably why.
Okay, there's a question for you here, which is, you mentioned net zero working group for businesses. What targets are you working towards in terms of the day? Is it 2030, 2032, 2050?
So we've had our first meeting, which was a few weeks ago. We've got another meeting in September, and the idea is that the businesses will come up with a plan and solutions in due course. So we haven't got the full plan yet, but they're working towards that, and it will be in collaboration with councils and with the Mayor's office. Pretty new innovation for us.
And I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to take this one from Harriet Lamb, but I've got others on the same topic. On could the GLA commit to helping all London schools reach net zero carbon by 2030? It would need central government funding at a far bigger scale than today's announcement, but schools could also benefit from support from local authorities, e.g. to retrofit their buildings, encourage walking and cycling to school, ensuring local food in school meals. So could the Mayor really lead, I guess, on creating net zero schools by 2030? I guess, again, Shirley, that's first and foremost a question for you.
Well, I think we'd love to be able to do that, but as you highlighted, that's going to take a lot of funding, capital funding, in order to do that, but also technical assistance. But we have been working since 2016 on a retrofit program for schools, and seen a lot of schools already making progress to decarbonise. And we have a technical assistance program there, so that any boroughs out there or any schools out there, do get in touch, because we have both the technical assistance and, at the moment, the capital financing to do that. But for every school in London to be done, it's going to require a much bigger effort. So again, the government's announcement today about supporting schools, that's looking at the detail on that, because that doesn't really seem to be taking the opportunity to really do a deep decarbonisation to help meet the government's 2050 targets, or in London the 2030 target objective that the Mayor has. And we'd really urge government to take the opportunity to do that. If you're retrofitting now, don't go back and try and retrofit for carbon later. We should be really doing this in a sort of holistic way.
And a question here, and I guess this is for all panelists. A green economy needs to be a circular economy. So how far have you progressed in practical terms towards creating a circular economy, reducing waste ultimately to zero? So your waste is something, it's the sort of unglamorous aspect of these things. We're thinking about doing some work on it at Centre for London. How close are we to having a circular economy? Muniya, is this something that London First is looking at?
Our net zero group, it might be an area we look at, but like you, it's not a policy area that is particularly well developed for us. So okay. I'd pass that one on to the other panelists.
Mark, circular economy, waste, what are other cities doing?
Where we've seen most progress is tends to be in those cities that have got a really strong strategic partnership between the city government and business. So Amsterdam, the core of their development plan for the city is essentially around a circular economy. So they're working very closely to design regulation that really creates and pushes markets, but strategically designing it with business rather than having a conversation through the form of procurement. So trying to develop new jobs, new businesses in Amsterdam that design products differently so that they can be reused, turned into other things after their first use has finished, rather than simply discarded and having to be treated as waste. Copenhagen's got a similar kind of approach, but from what I've seen, I think it needs that. It needs that really tight relationship between the public and the private sector.
Great. And Shirley, are we making progress?
We are making some progress. So circular economy is part of the environmental strategy. Sadiq has said as part of our recovery, when we talk about green recovery, we're looking at, how to make our economy more circular. And practical examples of that, we've incorporated a circular economy sort of statement. So in new developments, we're asking developers to look at how they might take a more circular approach in terms of the building developments that they undertake. We're looking at it through procurement and through the joint waste body that the Mayor and the London local authorities are part of. Their business plan is looking at both climate change and the circular economy and how we might work with businesses and boroughs. So increasing food waste, for example, so that we can start food waste collection so that we can start to reuse that better. But we're also been lobbying government to make sure, really a lot of this is down to setting the businesses' targets and requirements for them to really look at their products and services to really make sure that the products they use are recyclable and can be repaired and so on.
Great. I've got a question that you might reflect on and come back to at the end, which is, if we were to be reading, we're all doing a lot of reading now, we're all locked down and can't go out to the pub, perhaps that's going to change soon, but what's the one book, article, author that we should be reading about climate change? But think about that a bit, and I'll come back to that question in a moment. But in the meantime, I've got a question on heating. So one of London's highest emission issues, of course, is heating homes and businesses. What other practical ideas from around the world would you most like to see London or Londoners adopt? Again, let me start with Mark. I mean, where can we really learn from when it comes to cutting carbon emissions related to heating of our homes and other buildings?
Well, I have to say, I think the answer here is really, it's not so much what London can learn, but what the UK government can learn. Because if London was empowered in the way that other cities are to regulate the building sector, we would have a much more thriving market around retrofit, and we would be far, far more advanced towards the targets that need to be hit for it. Really, the Mayor is at the limit of his powers in what he's already doing here. And for there to be a massive change, there's got to be a change from central government. I think this is the moment to do it, because the opportunity for creating lots of jobs very quickly really is there. It's a difficult thing to do politically. It's the kind of thing that central government should devolve to mayors and let them take the political risk and let them see if they can make it successful, as Tony Blair did with Ken Livingstone with the congestion charge. And transferred the risk and allowed a brave mayor to introduce something that ultimately worked. If it hadn't have worked, he'd have lost his job.
Great. Shirley.
In terms of decarbonising heat, I think, Mark's talked, we don't really have the powers to do that. So as he said, transfer the powers to us and we'd get on with it. Or they could do what the Dutch have done and just say, set a target and saying, no more gas boilers, we're going to decarbonise by doing X, Y, and Z. Our biggest issue, for example, the mayor's been challenging some of the energy from waste plants, incinerator plants based in London. Connecting those up would be a start, and mandating that as a requirement, so that we can start to heat our homes and start to sort of minimise the emissions from that sort of wasted heat would be a good start too.
Okay, and now it's a difficult question, or perhaps particularly difficult for Muniya. It's about aviation, and everybody's working on assumption, and you've made the case for the importance of getting the visitor economy going again. Governments negotiating bridgeheads so that Britons can travel abroad. And how is the continuing growth of air travel compatible with us meeting our climate change commitments and becoming a low carbon city? Muniya.
So, we have to get the sector up and running because of its economic importance, but the industry can still push ahead with its decarbonisation plans at the same time. The two things can't be mutually exclusive. So what we're hearing from our members is that increased use of tech will reduce some overseas meetings that won't be replicated even when we do get back to some semblance of normality. But it's important to remember that it's something like 1.5 million jobs that are supported by air transport. 40% of our trade is with non-EU countries, and that involves travelling by plane. And there are whole sectors of the economy that won't get back to full strength without international connections from manufacturers who rely on air travel to export goods to universities. So we don't see the two things as mutually exclusive. The airline industry has a role and a responsibility to grow in a sustainable way.
Okay, Mark, are you a big fan of the air industry? Are you happy to see? Are you convinced? Let me put it out. That's less popular. Are you convinced that it can become a low carbon industry, or do we just have to travel less? Surely we have to travel less by plane.
Right now we have to travel less because the technological solutions are not there for the air industry to be sustainable. I'm very confident it will get there in the end, but and the point particularly is we're seeing bailouts for the air industry. They have got to come with incredibly tough strings attached that really force the industry to properly invest in moving much more quickly to be in as low a carbon form of transport as it possibly can. But in the meantime, we need government to design for sectors that rely on tourism, particularly as we were hearing earlier for the retail sector in London, that is much more creative, so that tourism is based on tourism that can get there by a train or by other forms of public transport. And we're seeing that. It's interesting looking at what New Zealand's been doing in a country that's so far away from everyone else, has been much more successful in combating COVID, and is therefore now designing essentially a national tourism program for an economy that's really reliant on tourism, recognising that it's not going to be inviting large numbers of people in for quite some time.
Fascinating. And Shirley?
I think Muniya said, you can't. We need to protect the aviation sector for growth, and the CCC has allowed a certain amount of growth. But I think the fact that they've been soft pedaling and in fact actually not doing anything for the last few years, and now using the recovery from pandemic as a requirement for bailouts, but without any green strings. Sadiq's already talked about green strings. That's just not tenable. There are a number of things they could be doing, not just relying on technology. There's some hard choices that they could be making. Certainly looking at their plans and seeing how they could be compliant with the 2050 target, the 1.5 degree 1.5C Paris Agreement. Those are things that they could be getting on with now to show good faith, rather than pushing it off into the long grass yet again. They're the only sector I can think of that has done nothing really on looking, taking some really hard choices about what they can be doing on climate change. And I think people aren't going to stand for it. And there's lots of things that we can be doing, to look at aviation. Mark's talked about some of the stuff around, working from home, for example. We should be investing in better IT, 5G, and so on. Those are an alternative sort of public transport. Those are things that people are expecting. We saw the Sky polling recently that's talking about people wanting to not revert to what was the sort of the economy and life before the pandemic. This is a huge opportunity, and the aviation and airport sector ought to be following that too.
Okay. Question, a rather detailed question, but I think an important one about e-scooters. Should e-scooters be part of the government's trials, or should privately owned e-scooters be part of the government's trials of shared e-scooters, as well as shared e-scooters? And are e-scooters in general, particularly privately owned ones, a key part of decarbonising London's transport system? Muniya, do you have views on e-scooters at London First?
I think they're part of the mix. Well, they're part of the mix, but I think what we've got to do is learn from cities which have liberalised too quickly on e-scooters, and where they've been plagued by pedestrian obstructions and issues with street space management. So I think they're part of the mix, but they're not a silver bullet.
Mark, e-scooters, we do seem to be a bit behind on this in London. I think the government's been sort of slow to react and nervous. You an enthusiast?
I'm a big fan. I know, mayors across C40 have wildly different views about this. I have to say, I'm a fan based on what I've seen, because I've seen the difference they make in cities that were completely dominated by the car, particularly in North America. And to see thousands of people now getting out of their car and using scooters in cities like Los Angeles is really very encouraging. I mean, I tend towards though they should be shared schemes. We don't want to go from one vehicle, albeit a much bigger one, that isn't used for 95% of the day and sits taking up space, to another one that we all need to own. This is a perfect model for shared ownership.
Really, I would have thought an e-scooter is something you can fold it up and put it in your backpack. It seems to be rather different from a car. But anyway, Shirley, are we going to be seeing e-scooters all over London if the mayor has his way?
I think Sadiq and Heidi will have talked about being part of the pilot that the government is running. But I think Munea's, already pointed out there are huge issues around regulation and how do you use shared space safely, and that hasn't really been sorted out. So I think subject to those things, it is part of the mix. If it's an alternative to the car, then yes, but it has to be done safely. It has to be done in a shared way. And not dominating street space, swapping one problem with another.
Okay, listen, we're nearly at an end, so I'm going to ask one more question from Charlotte Holtz, and then I'm going to ask you to suggest or recommend a book or article. So Charlotte asks, for young people joining the workforce, to those leaving long careers in high carbon industries, how can we all contribute to effective greener career development and helping Londoners in that way? And what role for FE colleges in this? So a question about sort of green skills. I mean, we don't talk about this very much, but we will say that green economy will be good for it. Muniya, you're big on skills. London First holds a huge skills fairs every year. How do we ensure that both young Londoners and those changing jobs have the green skills that they need?
I think we need to look at how we manage apprenticeships. We have to look in schools, and we have to make sure that we reskill in order to create the kind of sustainable economy that we need. So we do run a big jobs fair every year. Skills London will be doing it virtually. We haven't traditionally, apart from the Environment Agency, had a particularly big focus on green jobs, but I think that will inevitably change. And it's about, inspiring young people about the whole range of opportunities. And clearly, there are going to be lots of jobs in scrapping gas boilers, retrofitting homes, loft insulation, EV infrastructure, and with a tighter immigration regime, we're going to need to upskill our own workforce. So I think there's huge opportunity there for green jobs.
Shirley, green jobs. I mean, yes. Are they just those sort of? Give me a sense of the sort of shape of the green economy in London and where the potential for growth is. You think?
So the biggest sector of that environmental goods and services sector is the carbon finance sector. So most people, when you think about green jobs, you start thinking, oh, it's fitters, isn't it? Isn't it sort of insulators and so on? But actually, it's the gamut of jobs, and it's engineers, it's architects, it is the fitters, it's the people who are going to be sorting out our electric vehicles or the zero emission capable taxis. So a whole range of jobs that are out there, and we just got to make sure, working through, for example, the skills agencies and the adult education budgets that the Mayor controls or has an input into, working with the economic partnerships that we run in London with London First and others, identifying where those new sectors are going to be and where we want them to be. So it's in the clean tech industries. We run a number of accelerator projects, and actually, it's probably really surprising to people, but actually the biggest sort of sector in London is the SME sector. It's not big businesses and big industry. So what is it that they need? And often it's sort of finance and understanding, well, what does circular economy mean? Or how do I have help in changing my idea in getting it invested and financed? So it's those sorts of activities and skills that we're going to really invest in, and that's part of the recovery effort that we're working on with London councils, with other stakeholders like London First and others.
Brilliant. Okay, right, time for our panelists to recommend their article or author that we should read over the summer on climate change. Mark.
Well, I mean, I still think if it's a book, it's last year's, but David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth, the first part of that, to get a sense of the true enormity of the climate crisis we are sleepwalking into. It's the best thing going. But actually, much shorter, the thing that's really caught me in the last few weeks is an article, Racism is Killing the Planet, by Hop Hopkins, who's from the Sierra Club, an environmental group in the US. And the key point he really points out, that in order for humanity to have allowed climate breakdown to continue for so long, you've got to have what he calls sacrifice zones. You've got to have parts of the planet where the people causing the pollution are prepared to accept that those people are going to die and be disadvantaged. And the same is true wherever you live in a city. In order to allow air pollution to carry on for so long, you've got to have parts of the city where you just accept that those people are going to have lung disease, etc. And that's just that's just the way it is. And in both cases, it's generally black and brown people and ethnic minorities in those cities who tend to live in those places. And so racism, climate breakdown go inextricably together. It's very powerful.
Brilliant. Minea.
So I'm going to recommend a children's book, if you've got primary school age children, called The Rhythm of the Rain, which is a lovely picture book about the water cycle.
Great. Okay. Shirley.
Oh, I'm not going to be so as interesting as the other two. So I probably haven't got around to it yet, but the CCC progress report, which is really a big and meaty tome, I guess. But I guess if I'm thinking sort of broader than that, then anything by Robert Macfarlane, The Lost Words. I've just seen there's a lovely French version that's come out, which is beautifully illustrated. So any of those sort of books reminding us of how important nature is to our recovery. We've talked a lot about retrofitting buildings and green spaces, but actually, one of the things that you can really appreciate from lockdown, and I've appreciated, is getting a bit closer to nature and seeing that in our city. It really does make a difference to your spirits. And I think remembering that as part of a recovery, anything like any book around that would help. I think just make us think about what's possible.
Great. And I'm going to use the chair's privilege and actually recommend the last book that Benjamin Barber wrote before he died, in which he made the case for the sort of crucial role that mayors and cities can play combating climate change. Right, I haven't had a chance, I'm afraid, to ask all the questions. There were lots of them, but I think that's just testimony to the sort of the interest that the session has aroused. So it just remains for me to thank our brilliant speakers, the Mayor, Mark, Muniya, and Shirley. It's been a pleasure to have you all with us and start this conversation ahead of Climate Action Week, which starts on the 1st of July, the day after tomorrow. Centre for London is doing more work on London recovery. Please sign up to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter at Centre for London to keep in touch. It If you're interested in supporting or funding Centre for London project this or an event on this theme or others, please again get in touch. But again, thank you to all of you out there in the audience for posing questions and joining us. And thanks again to our brilliant speakers. It's been a great session. Many thanks.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Hi there.